The morning Cecily Vane walked to Gracechurch Street for the first time as a woman in regular employment, she carried under her arm a small, battered commonplace book whose spine had been mended twice with brown thread. The October light was thin and particular, the kind that found every worn place on a person's coat and held it up for examination. Her coat had several. She did not slow her steps to account for it. She had made the decision the previous afternoon in her lodgings on Fetter Lane, sitting at a table barely wide enough for her elbows, with a letter in one hand and a list of figures in the other. The letter was from Mr. Hardcastle, a mercer of moderate reputation on Gracechurch Street, who had placed an advertisement for a bookkeeper of modest wage and required a trial period of 1 month before any formal arrangement was confirmed. The figures were what remained of her father's estate after the creditors had finished with it. The sum was negative, in the truest and most practical sense of the word. Her father had been a solicitor in Berkshire who loved books and trusted people, and died leaving behind £340 of debt and a daughter who had been educated well enough to understand exactly what £340 meant. She had been a seamstress for 2 months, and her fingers had not yet forgiven her for it. She was 24 years old, and she had spent those 2 months understanding, with the steady clarifying precision of a person who has finally stopped hoping for a different answer, that the world had one story it wished to tell about her, and she was not required to cooperate with it. The previous evening an earl had offered her the terms by which she might be saved. She had refused him. She had refused him twice, which was the number of options he had presented, and she was walking to Gracechurch Street on this pale October morning because she had found, quietly and without fanfare, a third one. The commonplace book had been her father's. He had filled it with law maxims, case citations, and the kind of small domestic observations that a man of careful mind makes when he is alone in the evenings. She had read it many times. She had begun, in the past 2 years, to write in the margins, and her marginal notes were not law, but something less tidy. The conclusions she had arrived at by living inside the circumstances her father's good faith had produced. She did not think of the book as instruction. She thought of it as company. She had not spoken to the Earl of Crestwich since the previous evening. She did not expect to speak to him again. She would like to say she had not thought of him since. This would not be accurate. If you have ever sat across a table from a man who believes he is rescuing you and felt, with perfect clarity, that you would rather drown, then perhaps you know the particular cold of that room. Stay with Cecily a moment, before we go back to where it began. She knocked at the side door of Hardcastle's shop at 8:15. Mr. Hardcastle, a stout man of 60 with ink on his thumb, and a manner of speaking that suggested he had once been a schoolmaster and had not entirely abandoned the habit of it, opened the door himself and looked her over with the frank assessment of a man inspecting a ledger. "Miss Vane," he said. "On time. Good. Come in." She came in. The storeroom smelled of beeswax and wool, and the faint underlayer of paper that shops of a certain age accumulate the way old houses accumulate damp. The ledgers were on a table to the left, 5 of them, in a state of organization that suggested they had been arranged by a person who knew which one to reach for, but could not have explained the system to anyone else. Cecily set down the commonplace book beside them and put on her gloves, and looked at the first ledger, and understood, within 4 minutes, 3 things about Mr. Hardcastle's bookkeeping that would need correcting before the month was out. She did not say any of this yet. She asked for the invoices from the previous quarter. Mr. Hardcastle produced them from a drawer. She began. This was the morning after the Earl of Crestwich had offered her marriage, or the workhouse. She would need to go back. It had begun, as most things of this kind begin, with money that no longer existed. Mr. Dover, who held the note on the house in Fetter Lane, had sent a letter in September informing Cecily that the terms of the note required her father's estate to satisfy the debt in full by the end of October, or the house would pass into his possession, and she would be required to vacate. The house was worth less than the debt. The estate had nothing left. Cecily had known for 6 months that the letter was coming, and had spent those 6 months becoming a seamstress, which was the most immediate thing available to her hands, and which she had pursued with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and which was not going to produce £340 by the end of October. Mr. Dover had also, she learned later, communicated the particulars of her situation to the Earl of Crestwich, who was Mr. Dover's superior in a matter related to a property in Surrey, and who had therefore heard, as a kind of social weather report, that a solicitor's daughter in Fetter Lane was about to be turned out. She did not know this when she received, on the last Thursday of September, a card requesting the honor of her company for a conversation at the Earl's townhouse in Grosvenor Square. She did not know what he wanted, and she went because she had been well enough raised to respond to formal invitations, and because she did not think she had anything left to lose by an hour's conversation. She lost nothing. She was also offered nothing she wished to take. The Earl of Crestwich, James Alderton, was 36 years old, and stood at a height that made most rooms feel arranged around him without his having arranged anything himself. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, in a way that seemed more deliberate than accidental. His face was that of a man who had been handsome younger, and had since become something steadier and more considered, the kind of face that took in a room before committing itself to an expression. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, and he turned, and he looked at her with an attention so complete and so entirely without performance that she had to remind herself he was not a friend. He asked her to sit. She sat. He told her, with the directness of a man who did not believe in softening what needed to be understood, that he had become aware of her situation, and that he had a proposal to make. He had two, in fact, which he laid out in sequence, with the calm efficiency of a man presenting the terms of a contract. The first was that she could marry him. A marriage of practical arrangement, he was careful to say, not a love match, and he understood she might find the suggestion impertinent. But the facts of her circumstances were such that the arrangement would resolve them immediately and completely. The second was that he could arrange for her a position at the Alderton Workhouse in Southwark, where the women's superintendent was a person of good character, and where she would have a respectable situation and be clothed and housed and occupied. He waited for her answer. Cecily Vane sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at James Alderton, Earl of Crestwich, and felt something settle in her chest that she could only describe as the complete absence of surprise. This was the world's story about her. She had been a problem, and he had arrived with 2 solutions, and he was waiting now to find out which solution she would accept. "I will not marry you," she said. "I do not know you, and I would not have you believe that the state of my accounts is a substitute for an inclination." He said nothing. He had the quality of stillness that does not try to fill silence. "I will not go to the workhouse," she said. "I have my health and my wits, and I am capable of finding employment. I have, in fact, already done so. I begin on Monday." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not precisely name. It was not surprise. It was not displeasure. It was the expression of a man who has presented a thorough map and found, to his interest, that the territory does not match. "You have already secured a position," he said. "I have," she said. "A trial period at a mercer's on Gracechurch Street." He was quiet for another moment. "The wage will be modest." "It will be mine," she said. She thanked him, which she was aware was a somewhat perverse thing to do, and she left. She thought about him on the walk home, with a feeling she recognized as something between gratitude and irritation, which was itself unusual, because she had not felt irritated by anything in some months. She had been too tired for irritation. It required a surplus she had not possessed. She examined the feeling in the thin September light and decided that what irritated her was not the offer itself, which she understood to be motivated by something that was not unkindness, but the architecture of it. 2 options, both of them his, both of them requiring her to step inside a shape he had already cut. She did not think he had considered that she might have been cutting shapes of her own. She went home and took out her father's commonplace book and wrote in the margin beside a maxim about contracts. A woman who refuses a bad bargain has not lost. She has merely refused to lose slowly. She read the line back once, decided it was accurate, and closed the book. The 4 days between Thursday and Monday had a particular texture she would not have predicted. She had expected to feel the weight of the refusal, the way one feels the weight of a door that has been shut and locked from the inside, some combination of relief and enclosure. What she felt instead was a kind of lightness that she did not immediately trust, the way a person does not immediately trust ice that is thinner than expected, and yet holds them. She had said no to a man who had the power to make the circumstances of her life considerably simpler, and she was still in her lodgings on Fetter Lane with £340 of debt and a trial period at a mercer's on Gracechurch Street beginning in 4 days. And the lightness was not the lightness of someone who has nothing to fear. It was the lightness of someone who has finally consented to carry only what is hers. She used the 4 days practically. She went to Mr. Hardcastle on Friday to confirm the arrangement in person, having received his letter of offer through a mutual connection of her father's, who had once retained the mercer's services and had thought, at a loss as to what else to do for a solicitor's daughter in reduced circumstances, that a word in Hardcastle's ear might not go amiss. She walked to Gracechurch Street and presented herself at the side door, and Mr. Hardcastle looked her over in the manner that was to become familiar and asked her 4 questions about bookkeeping and 1 about her father's line of work, and then said the arrangement would begin Monday at 8:15, and the trial period was 1 month, and the wage was 9 shillings a week. She said the arrangements were acceptable. They shook hands. She went home and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was hungry for the first time in several weeks. On Saturday, she went to a lending library and borrowed 2 books, one on the practice of double-entry accounting in commercial establishments and one on the properties of silk and wool as trade goods, because she thought it would not hurt to know more about what Hardcastle sold than what the invoice columns would tell her. She returned both on Sunday. She had read them. Then she went to bed. And in the morning, she walked to Gracechurch Street. By the end of her first week at Hardcastle's, Cecily had found the error in the wool account, corrected the September invoice for the Alderton estate, and declined with some firmness the shilling that Mr. Hardcastle had offered to press into her hand as a supplement to her agreed wage. "You made up the £12, he said, gesturing at the ledger in a way that indicated he knew perfectly well what he meant, even if the gesture did not clarify it for anyone else. "I made up the £12 because the ledger was wrong," she said. "The work was already mine to do correctly." He looked at her with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being refused and is finding it, against his expectations, somewhat refreshing. He put the shilling away. She did not know, because she could not see behind the shelf of folded bolts to the left of the counter, that there was a man standing there who had heard the exchange in its entirety. She had noticed, peripherally and without attaching significance to it, that a tall figure in a dark coat had entered the shop while she was at the counter and had been directed by the young assistant to wait, and that the young assistant had then been called away by a delivery at the rear of the shop, leaving the figure among the bolts. She had returned her attention to the ledger. This was a mistake, though not in the way she would later understand. James Alderton had come to Harcastle's on a matter of the estate account, which was true. He had asked before coming whether Harcastle employed a bookkeeper, which was also true, and had phrased the question in a way that did not reveal why he was asking. He was not in the habit of self-examination on such points. He had come because it was an estate matter. He would think about the rest later. He stood behind the shelf of bolts and listened to Cecily Vane decline a shilling she had earned. He listened to the certainty in her voice, which was not the certainty of arrogance, but the certainty of a person who has thought a thing through to its conclusion and trusts the conclusion. He listened to the way she said the work was already mine to do correctly, and felt something shift in his chest that he had no immediate word for. He waited until she had returned to the ledgers, and then he moved, with the deliberate calm of a man who does not startle easily, to the counter. She looked up. They were perhaps 3 feet apart, with the counter and the ledger between them. She was wearing a dress the color of pale slate, and a small strand of her brown hair had come loose at her temple from whatever arrangement held the rest of it, and she looked at him with an expression that contained no particular welcome and no particular coldness either. Just attention. The same precise attention she had turned on the ledger. "My lord," she said. "Miss Vane," he said. "I am told the Alderton estate account has been transferred to your management." "For this quarter's invoices, yes," she said. "I identified a discrepancy of £12 from the previous quarter that Mr. Harcastle's former bookkeeper had entered incorrectly. I have prepared a corrected figure." She handed him a slip of paper. He looked at it. He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the shop's front window and found the strand of hair at her temple and held it there like a question he did not know how to ask. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "The figure is correct," he said finally. "Yes," she said. He left the slip of paper on the counter for her and took his leave and went out into the October Street and stood for a moment with the cold air at his face, which he had not expected to need. The evening after he visited Harcastle's shop, Lady Alderton came to her nephew's study without knocking, which was a habit she had maintained for 30 years, and which Alderton had ceased to object to some time after his 30th birthday, when he had come to understand that her entrances were not rudeness, but a form of information, arriving as they did precisely when she had something to say that she did not wish to announce with a knock. She had heard, through the particular social machinery that Lady Alderton had spent 40 years constructing and maintaining, that he had been seen entering a mercer's shop on Gracechurch Street. She had heard who the bookkeeper was. "A solicitor's daughter with nothing left to sell," she said. She said it from the doorway in the manner of a woman who has assessed a situation completely and is delivering her verdict as a service to the listener. "I cannot imagine what you are about, James. Miss Pemberton is in town, and she has been patient." He was at his desk with the Edinburgh letter. He did not look up. "I had a matter of the estate account," he said. "You have a solicitor for estate accounts," she said. "You have had one for 16 years." He said nothing further. Lady Alderton looked at him for a moment with the expression she wore when she had made an argument she expected to win and was deciding how long to give it to work. "The Pemberton family," she said, "is not going to wait indefinitely." "No," he said. "I expect they are not." She left. He went back to the letter. He held it for a long time without reading it. In the 3rd week of October, Lady Alderton held an afternoon tea at Grosvenor Square for 6 women, among them Miss Aurelia Pemberton, who was 22 and impeccably turned out, and had been told since childhood that she would make an excellent countess. Lady Alderton was the Earl's aunt, a woman of 60 with the bearing of a general who has never lost a campaign, and the social intelligence of someone who has managed, through 40 years of careful work, to make her preferences appear to be the preferences of everyone in the room. It was at this tea that Mr. Alderton's family solicitor, who had been summoned for a brief consultation on a matter of the estate trust, happened to mention, in the way that solicitors sometimes do when they are conducting several matters at once and have slightly miscalculated the hour, that the Alderton estate's bookkeeping had recently been consolidated at a mercer's on Gracechurch Street and was being handled by a Miss Vane. The room adjusted itself around the name in the particular way of a room that has not been given permission to speak, and is therefore doing so without speaking. Lady Alderton set down her teacup with the care of a woman who is recalibrating. "Miss Vane," she said, "a solicitor's daughter with nothing left to sell." She addressed this remark to no one in particular, in the manner of a woman who is establishing a fact rather than making a judgment, and she moved on to another subject before anyone could respond. Miss Pemberton looked at her tea. She had heard the name before, in connection with a conversation she had not been present for, but whose outlines had been communicated to her by her mother the previous week, and she was the kind of well-bred young woman who knows when a room has shifted temperature and does not ask questions about why. She understood, without being told, that Lady Alderton had not said the phrase in order to diminish Miss Vane. She had said it in order to locate her, the way one places a pin in a map to mark something that is no longer in motion. Mrs. Farnley, who was seated nearest the fire, and who had known Lady Alderton for 35 years, and understood her methods the way a cartographer understands a difficult coastline, looked at the window and said that the weather had been uncommonly cold for October, and the others agreed, and the room settled around this observation as around a safe thing, and the name did not come up again. The solicitor departed. No one said anything further. No one needed to. The damage that Lady Alderton dealt was never loud. It was the kind of damage that announced itself as information rather than as wound, so that when you felt it later, in the particular quiet of an evening when you were alone, it was difficult to say precisely what had struck you, or when. A week later, on a morning when the rain had settled into the particular persistent drizzle that makes London feel like a city constructed entirely indoors, Alderton appeared at Harcastle's shop at 11 o'clock and conducted what appeared to be a brief business conversation with Mr. Harcastle at the back of the premises. He then came to the counter, where Cecily was finishing the October wool invoices, and stood for a moment looking at the ledger rather than at her. "The walk to Fetter Lane will be unpleasant in this weather," he said. "It was unpleasant in September as well," she said, without looking up. "I managed." "Allow me to send the carriage," he said. The words came out flat and direct, which was the only way he appeared to know how to produce them. She looked up then. He was looking at the ledger, not at her, and his jaw had the particular set of a man who has offered a thing and is uncertain whether it was properly calibrated. "You are not required to send the carriage," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I would like to." She was quiet for a moment. She thought, absurdly, of the drizzle and the walk, and the way her coat had begun to take in damp at the left shoulder, where the seam had thinned. "Thank you," she said. The carriage arrived at 6 o'clock. It was a plain, dark vehicle with no crest on the door, and a driver who did not ask questions, and the interior was lined with a heavy wool that was slightly too warm for the season, in the way of something that had been arranged by someone who erred on the side of too much rather than risk too little. Cecily sat with her hands in her lap and felt the wool at her back, and felt, with a sensation she did not wish to examine directly, that she was inside something that had been built around her specific dimensions without its builder knowing what her specific dimensions were. She was delivered to Fetter Lane in 20 minutes. She went inside. She took out the commonplace book and did not write in it, but held it for a while. She had been at Harcastle's for 3 weeks when the Earl came to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon and asked, without preface, whether she had a few minutes to accompany him to Crestwich House on a matter related to the estate account. He had received a letter from the family trust in Edinburgh and was uncertain whether the figures matched what she had corrected in October's invoices. He thought it would take no more than an hour. She went. She was not sure exactly why she went, except that the explanation was plausible and the estate account was technically her concern, and she was not in the habit of refusing things for reasons she could not articulate. The library at Crestwich House was a room that had been thought about rather than merely assembled. The books were arranged by subject and then by date, and the fire had been lit at some point in the morning and had been tended since, which was either attentiveness or habit. She was not sure which. Alderton poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, and then opened the letter from Edinburgh on the desk between them. They looked at the figures together. They were on the left side of a column, and the corrected invoice figures were on the right. And they matched, as she had expected they would, because she had been careful. She said as much. He agreed. He set the letter down. There was a silence in the room that was not uncomfortable in the way that most silences between near strangers are uncomfortable, which Cecily noticed and then chose not to think about. "Why did you refuse the workhouse?" he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire. "I told you," she said. "I had already secured other employment." "Not that morning," he said. "On the morning I sent you the card, you had not yet secured the position. You told me so yourself. You said you began on Monday. The card was sent on Thursday. There were 4 days. You could have accepted the workhouse as a temporary measure and pursued the position afterward." He was right. She had not thought he was paying that kind of attention. "I did not want to go to the workhouse," she said. "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because it is a place one enters as a problem to be managed," she said. "I did not want to be managed." He was quiet for a longer moment. The fire shifted. He was still looking at it. And his profile in the firelight was the profile of a man who is working something out carefully, the way a person works out a sum that does not yet balance. "I offered you the marriage for the same reason," he said. "It was a solution. I am accustomed to solving things before they become unsolvable." She said nothing. "My sister," he said. And then he stopped. He started again. "My sister became ill in the autumn of 1812. I was in London on a matter of the estate. I had arranged, before I left, that the housekeeper would send for me if her condition worsened. The letter took 3 days to reach me. By the time I arrived, she had been 4 days in a fever, and had not come back out of it." He was still looking at the fire. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who has carried a fact for a very long time, and has learned to carry it without dropping it, but has not learned to put it down. "I had been the one who managed things. I thought that if I managed things correctly and in advance, the things would hold. I was wrong. The belief has not entirely released me." Cecily sat with her hands in her lap and felt the weight of what he had said moving through the room like weather. "The marriage was not an insult," he said. "I need you to know that." "I know that," she said. "That was not why I refused it." "Then why?" She looked at her hands. "Because it was not a question," she said. "It was a list of your solutions. I did not appear in it." The fire shifted again. He looked at her then, fully, for the first time since the letter had been set down. His eyes were gray, a particular gray that was not cold and not warm, but entirely clear, the color of early light over standing water. "I did not offer you marriage because it was the solution," he said. "I offered it because I did not know how else to ask you to stay." He said it quietly, in the voice of a man admitting a thing to himself as much as to her. a single short interior crack, which was the first she had seen. She did not answer at once. There was a small sound from somewhere in the house, a door closing, a step on a stair, and then the fire and the quiet. "I think you should ask questions rather than offer solutions," she said finally. "It produces better accounts." Something moved across his face that might, in a man less controlled, have been called a smile. She returned to Hardcastle's the next morning and set the commonplace book in its usual place on the left side of the desk and began the November invoices. She worked steadily. The shop filled and emptied, and filled again. She thought about the library at Crestwich House with the fire and the letter and the gray of his eyes, and then she thought about something else, and then she thought about it again. On the Thursday of that week, she arrived at the shop in the morning to find the young assistant, whose name was Thomas, waiting for her at the door with an expression of a person who has been given a message and is uncertain of its reception. "A message, Miss Vane," Thomas said, "from Lady Alderton." She took the note. It was politely worded in the manner of a woman who has been polite for 60 years and has refined the practice into a form of precision weaponry. It said that the November invoices for the Alderton estate account would henceforth be managed by the family solicitor rather than through Hardcastle's arrangement, and that it had been a pleasure to know that the accounts were in order, and it wished her well. It was a dismissal. It was also, she understood, a message about territory. She set the note on the desk beside the commonplace book and looked at them both for a moment. Then, at 11 o'clock, the maid who had sometimes brought notes to Fetter Lane on the Earl's behalf knocked at the side door. Cecily opened it. The maid had the face of a person who has been asked to deliver a thing she finds distasteful and has not been given a graceful way to do it. "Lady Alderton has said," the maid began, and then stopped, and tried again. "She has been saying, Miss Vane, to everyone who will listen, that you are nothing but a solicitor's daughter with nothing left to sell. I am sorry to say it. I thought you should know." Cecily thanked her. She closed the side door. She stood for a moment in the storeroom with its smell of beeswax and wool and paper, with the sound of the street outside and the sound of her own breathing, and she looked at the November invoices that were no longer hers to complete, and the commonplace book that was sitting on the desk, and she made a decision that was not dramatic and did not require an audience. She was not going to leave. She went back to the counter and opened the December invoices, which had nothing to do with the Alderton estate, and she began. The carriage did not come that evening. She walked home in the cold and did not let herself think about it. 3 days passed. Then a week. The Earl did not come to the shop. He did not send a card. He did not send the carriage. Cecily finished the November accounts for the rest of Hardcastle's customers, who were fewer and less complicated than the Alderton estate, but who were not nothing, and she arrived each morning at 8:15 and left each evening at 5:30, and she did not permit herself to examine the feeling that sat in her chest like a stone that has been there long enough to be mistaken for architecture. She had been the problem. She had refused both solutions. She had said, in the library of Crestwich House, with the fire and the Edinburgh letter and the grey of his eyes, that he should ask rather than offer, and he had looked at her with the first crack she had seen in the whole careful surface of him, and she had thought, with a certainty she had not questioned until now, that this was the beginning of something. She had been wrong before. She had been wrong about her father's accounts, briefly, in the first weeks after his death, when she had believed the debts were smaller than they were, and she had corrected the error and adjusted her expectations and moved forward. This was the same. It was just a correction. She had confirmed what the world already knew. She was too proud for her station and too poor for her pride. And the Earl of Crestwich had finally understood this and moved on to Miss Pemberton, who was neither too proud nor too poor, and who would make an excellent countess. And that was the correct outcome. And Cecily was glad of it. She examined this gladness each morning on the walk to Gracechurch Street, with the critical attention she brought to ledger columns, looking for the error. The gladness held. It did not feel like gladness exactly, but she was prepared to accept that gladness in reduced circumstances presents somewhat differently than in prosperous ones. On the Thursday of the first week, she stayed later than usual because the December wool accounts had a discrepancy of 4 shillings that she was determined to find before she left. She found it at 6:30 in a transposition in the 5th column that had been there since September and had compounded forward quietly in the manner of errors that are not looked for. She corrected it. She put on her coat. She looked at the commonplace book on the desk and picked it up and held it for a moment, in the way she sometimes did when she was deciding something. She put it back down. She went home. She wrote nothing in the margins of the commonplace book that week. On the Monday of the second week, she arrived at the shop at 8:15 and found Mr. Harcastle already in the storeroom with a look on his face that she had learned to associate with something that had gone slightly wrong, and he was hoping she would know how to fix it. "There's a man outside," he said. "Has been there for a quarter hour. Won't come in." She looked. Through the front window she could see a tall figure in a dark coat standing in the street in the particular posture of a man who has arrived somewhere and is uncertain of his welcome. The October light, the same thin light she had walked through to her first day, was doing the same thing it had done that morning, finding every worn place and examining it. James Alderton was standing in Gracechurch Street, and he was not presenting a solution. She went to the door. She opened it and stood in the frame and looked at him. He looked at her. He was not holding his hat. He was not prepared, she thought, for whatever he had come to say. "I withdrew," he said. "I should not have. I did not know what else to do when you refused both options, and then I did nothing, which was worse." Behind her, from the direction of the corner, came the sound of carriage wheels, and then the sound of 2 women's voices, which she recognized as Lady Alderton, and beside her, Miss Pemberton, who had apparently chosen this particular morning to call on a milliner's 2 doors down, and had not expected, on their return, to find the Earl of Crestwich standing in the street in front of a mercer's shop on Gracechurch Street, looking at a woman in a gray wool dress. Cecily was aware of them. She was also aware that she was not going to let their arrival change anything, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she had been asking herself all week. Alderton's jaw tightened. He had heard them. He did not look away from Cecily. "I came to ask, will you have me, Miss Vane?" His voice was level and clear, and the street was suddenly very quiet, the way streets become quiet when something is happening in them that has weight. 12 words. No solutions inside them. Just the question, which was the thing she had told him to bring. She did not answer at once. She turned back to the doorway and reached for the commonplace book, which was on the desk immediately inside. She opened it to the margin note she had written the evening after she had walked home from Grosvenor Square with nothing in her hands. She held it out to him. He read it. She watched his face while he read it. She had written, "A woman who refuses a bad bargain has not lost. She has merely refused to lose slowly." He looked up. His expression was the expression of a man who has been correctly understood and does not know quite what to do with the experience. "This was the 3rd option," he said. "Yes," she said. "You wrote this the evening I made the offer." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Lady Alderton had stopped walking. Miss Pemberton had stopped beside her. The mercer's assistant had appeared in the doorway of the milliner's 2 doors down, and was watching with the frank interest of a young man who does not often see earls standing in the street on Gracechurch Street looking at bookkeepers. "Will you have me?" he said again. Cecily Vane stood in the doorway of a mercer's shop with her father's commonplace book in her hands, and looked at James Alderton, Earl of Crestwich, who had arrived with a question instead of a list, and felt something in her chest unhinge itself from the place where it had been held for 6 weeks. "You will need to stop arranging things without asking first," she said. "I know," he said, "and you will need to learn to ask, not offer." "I am practicing," he said, and the word practicing, coming from that particular face, in that particular voice, in that particular street, was the funniest and most honest thing she had heard anyone say in a very long time. She felt it move through her like the beginning of something. "Then yes," she said, "I will have you." Lady Alderton said nothing. She turned. Miss Pemberton turned beside her. They walked on, which was the most that could be asked of anyone in the circumstances, and was perhaps more than the moment required, and less than Lady Alderton's usual authority demanded. It was, Cecily thought, a correction. Mr. Harcastle appeared behind her left shoulder. "The November accounts," he said, addressing this to the general air, "are still not finished." "I will finish them this afternoon," Cecily said without turning around. "Good," said Mr. Harcastle. He went back inside. Alderton looked at her for a moment. He extended his hand. She took it. She was wearing her working gloves, which were plain gray wool and slightly too large at the knuckles, and his hand closed around hers, with a steadiness that was not a grip, and not quite a hold, but something in between that had no better word for it. "May I call this evening?" he said. "Yes," she said. She went back inside. She set the commonplace book on the desk beside the December accounts, and she looked at it for a moment, at her father's handwriting in the main columns and her own in the margins, interleaved, the careful law maxims and the messier conclusions that living had produced. She thought about her father, who had trusted people and loved books, and left her with both of those habits and a great deal of debt, and she thought that he would not have disapproved of this afternoon, on balance. She put on her working gloves and opened the November accounts and began. He came at 7 o'clock, and the fire in the small sitting room at Fetter Lane, which Cecily had lit that afternoon for the first time since September, because the cold had finally decided it was staying, was doing what fires in small rooms do when they are needed, filling the space with a warmth that asks nothing in return. He sat across from her, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential, about the Edinburgh Trust and the December accounts, and the particular problem of a ledger whose previous bookkeeper had organized by memory rather than by system, and she found that conversation with him was not what she had expected, which was a negotiation, but something quieter and more accidental, the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people have stopped preparing for each other. He left at 9. At the door he paused and said, without turning around, that he would send the carriage in the morning. She told him she preferred to walk. He said he knew. He sent it anyway, which was not precisely asking, but which she had begun to understand was the form his improvement took when he was still working at it, which was often. She stood at the window after he left and watched the street go quiet. The month's cold had finally settled, the kind that comes when autumn gives up being anything other than winter, and the cobblestones were wet, and the lamplight caught the wet in small, bright seams across the street. She thought about what it was to have made a third option out of nothing, which was not nothing at all, but was the sum of everything that had been left to her, the education, the figures, the steadiness her father had passed on along with the debt, and the small battered book with its margin notes and its mended spine. She went to the desk and opened it to the page where she had written the note about refusing bad bargains. And below it, in the same small, careful hand, she wrote one more line. She did not always show it to anyone. She had shown it to him, and he had read it, and he had asked. That was the thing. He had asked. She closed the book. The fire settled. Outside, the first night of November was doing what November does, which is to arrive without apology and stay as long as it wishes. And Cecily Vane sat in the small warmth of the sitting room at Fetter Lane with her father's book in her hands and the quiet, unhurried feeling of a woman who has finally arrived somewhere she had not known she was walking toward. The commonplace book sat on the desk in the new house by the following February, in a room with better windows and a fire that did not need tending as often, because the house had been built when people thought about such things. He had moved it himself when she was not looking, from the desk she had used at Fetter Lane to the desk in what was now her study, and placed it beside the morning's correspondence in a way that suggested he thought it belonged there. She had come in to find it and had not said anything. She had not needed to. There are things a person does that speak more plainly than their good intentions, and one of them is knowing which book goes on which desk, and putting it there. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a word in the quiet. She would like to know you were here.